Unit 14, Social Psychology. Unit 14 is about sociological principles, social dynamics, group dynamics, and how psychology is affected by the presence of other people. As you can see, it's 8 to 10% of the AP exam. We'll get into some of the vocab. Social thinking. The chapter starts out with attribution theory, attitudes and actions. Inside of attribution theory, you have fundamental attribution error, which is the concept that people will overestimate how much you can blame a person's disposition for a situation. For instance, whether it's poverty or homelessness, or something along those lines. Fundamental attribution error is the idea that you cannot blame the person as much as the situation. Attribution theory has two different aspects to it. It has the situational attribution, which is blaming the situation, or it has a dispositional attribution, which is to assume that it is the result of a person's disposition, which is to say their character traits or personality traits. In central route persuasion versus peripheral route persuasion, this is the way that tactics are used to sway people's opinions using various techniques. Central route persuasion is using empirical data, information that is related to the specific topic itself, whether it's evidence or whether it's analysis, case studies, meta-analysis. Is the using actual data to persuade someone towards that point of view, whereas the peripheral route to persuasion is using things on the fringe, whether it would be famous spokespeople or an emotionally triggering commercial, pulling on someone's heartstrings, musical edits and videos and things like that. So two different ways that you can use to as paths to persuasion would be going directly to the issue itself, which is the central route to persuasion. The downside to the central route to persuasion is that you have to have an audience that is motivated to hear what it is that you have to say, and they have to be able to comprehend the message that they're going to hear. So while it is not as easy to convince someone towards that point of view, if they're not interested in hearing the perspective, it does tend to have a longer term effect on their conviction. The peripheral route to persuasion is more of an impulse. It is used when the audience is not as well versed in the topic, or they may not even have the ability on the same level to cognitively comprehend the message that's being used for persuasion. For instance, if you were to have an audience of kids, you would want to go the peripheral route to persuasion, try to entice them towards a topic or a point of view using something that's going to catch their attention, and hopefully you can use emotions and other outside superficial things to get them to sway their opinion one way or the other. So think in terms of political ads, think in commercials, think in purchasing vehicles, whether or not we have a motivated audience who knows what they are dealing with, or whether we have an unmotivated audience who may not be able to comprehend the narrative or just doesn't have any interest in the narrative. The foot in the door phenomenon is a metaphor for increasingly greater requests that are made, usually in an attempt to get people to move their boundaries, whether it's a sales tactic or it's something that's done in personal interactions and relationships. Foot in the door phenomenon usually refers to the tendency to start with a small, seemingly simple request, and then to grow those requests larger and larger from there, in an attempt to ultimately to get a much bigger favor or a much bigger question or granted, in terms of things like Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment everything starts with a small amount of voltage, which increasingly made its way up to a lethal level of voltage. And it's an example of the foot in the door phenomenon, because people would not start with such a high level of a request from someone who is an authority figure. It has to start with a smaller request and then increasingly go up from there. So also a sales tactic, or it could be something that's done in personal relationships. Cognitive dissonance theory is also an interesting topic. It is one that is important to understand. It is when dissonance refers to discomfort. So cognitive dissonance refers to the idea that when there's a conflict between someone's attitude and their behaviors or their actions, and they have a hard time justifying what they believe is correct versus what they did, then they will change the attitude to reflect the behavior. So in other words, if someone thinks that it is not morally okay to cheat on a test, but they cheated on a test, there's a discomfort there in the difference between what they believe to be morally correct and what they actually did as a behavior. So cognitive dissonance is the idea that you would need to make some kind of justification to alleviate the mental discomfort. So if you believe cheating is wrong, but yet you cheated on a quiz, what you would do in order to ease the cognitive discomfort is to justify the cheating and make an excuse for it. So essentially it's a form of hypocrisy that is the way to combat, or kind of a coping mechanism, a defense mechanism, if you will, when your actions don't line up with your convictions. So when the attitude doesn't match the action, and there's a level of discomfort there, then people, rather than fixing it and making it right, they will justify the actions in a way to feel like they didn't do something wrong. Examples of names to know, of course, Phillip Zimbardo with the 1971 Stanford prison experiment. Things to know about Zimbardo and kind of the idea behind the study itself was the power of social roles. Obviously, Zimbardo took healthy Stanford students, all male students, and divided them into two different roles, either guard or prisoner, and assigned them tasks within those roles. And what he was trying to test was the situational attribution, because Zimbardo doesn't believe that people are necessarily bad by nature, that there are environments that you can be put in and roles that you can serve, which will bring out those toxic traits. And so that's certainly what the Stanford prison experiment was designed to show. Obviously, there were a lot of flaws in the way that the study was executed, and there were definite ethical concerns. But Zimbardo is a name to know, and the Stanford prison experiment was about the power of social roles and a situational attribution as opposed to a dispositional attribution. They're not bad people, they're put in a situation that empowers them to abuse their role. So getting into the terms for influence of groups of people, social influence, there's several names to know. Solomon Asch is one with his conformity studies that go on with social influence. Why do people conform? Is something that Asch wanted to study. They conform for normative reasons, or they conform for informational reasons. Normative social influence would be conforming to a group standard out of the feeling of peer pressure. So the purpose of why someone conforms in a group setting would be to comply with the group so that they could be accepted, right, as a desire to be accepted or not be rejected. Normative social influence tends to be more displayed in younger groups, young teenage groups, people who fall victim to social influence like peer pressure. Whereas informational social influence is a little bit different. Informational social influence is still someone is conforming to a group standard, but they're not doing so out of peer pressure. They're doing so because they don't have a level of expertise, and they believe that the group knows better than they do. So in other words, in essence, they're following the lead with other people that they believe to be correct. So if you were in a group that was trying to decide something very significant, maybe like in a think tank or in a group at your job, and people were trying to solve or come up with a solution for a problem, someone using informational social influence might defer to the group just because they believe that the people in the group know better than they do. They would have the level of expertise. You also see informational social influence play out when people are in situations that are unfamiliar to them and they don't really know what the protocols are. And so an example of informational social influence in that way would be if you go to a sporting event or some kind of cultural event and you don't know what the customs are, then you would just tend to follow the lead of the people around you because you believe that they know the customs. So there's two different reasons why, according to Solomon Asch, that people conform in a group setting, and that's normative social influence for a desire to fit in, feel normal, if you want to remember it that way. But there's also the informational social influence, which is when people don't have a level of expertise and they don't know the protocol, and so they just defer to copying what people in the group do. Off of Solomon Asch is a colleague of his, which is Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram was a psych professor at Yale, just like Asch, and he set up probably one of the more infamous experiments in regards to obedience. It's a little less conformity, like Solomon Asch's line segment experiment, and it was more about the power of an authority figure and whether or not people will obey someone else who's perceived to be in that position of authority. And specifically, Stanley Milgram was testing the diffusion of responsibility. So if somebody would listen to an authority figure, they would be more likely to commit an act that violates their own personal ethic or moral code if they felt like they were following orders and the burden of responsibility fell on the person who was giving the instructions. So Solomon Asch is a little bit different than Stanley Milgram. Solomon Asch worked with Milgram. They knew each other. In fact, Asch was critical of Stanley Milgram's field experiments because he didn't think that they were ethical. But Asch was more concerned about how people could be pressured into conforming to a group standard even for something that's insignificant, like the comparison of line segments. Group influence dynamics, you have words like social facilitation, which is usually something that's positive. That's when people perform at a higher level, or they're kind of up their game, so to speak, when other people are around them. So that's kind of how the presence of others can increase your performance in, say, an athletic competition or musical performance or school play, something like that. The presence of people in the crowd and the excitement from that and the desire to do well is going to actually enhance the performance, and that's social facilitation. Social loafing is a little different. It is this term that explains why in a group where everyone is participating in a shared activity, then there are people who are going to take advantage of the opportunity to do less. So they'll slack off, and you see that in group projects at school where one person does very little work because everybody else in the group is doing the work. That's an example of social loafing. You also see that when things like when people are carrying heavy furniture. So everybody is kind of carrying the load collectively, and so it's easier for an individual person to exert less effort in trying to help carry the load, in this case literally, because that's an example of social loafing. Or another example would be if you hire 10 friends to do some landscaping yard work, there's a task to be completed and all 10 of them are working, and so there's not much of an incentive for each of them individually to do the same amount of work. Somebody might take advantage of the ability to slack off and just kind of make it look like they're working hard while everybody else completes the task. So that's social loafing. It's pretty obvious. Means exactly what you would think that it means. De-individuation is a little different. That is a group dynamic that is important to know. De-individuation is when people become empowered because of the anonymity that they get from being in a group. So you see examples of de-individuation play out in social protests that turn into riots, pep rallies, and this is kind of like the mob mentality. It's not so much that people are as emotionally wrapped up in the cause as they are empowered and emboldened by the fact that they don't feel like they'll get caught. So people will do things that they typically would not do if they were by themselves, right? So in other words, they don't find it to be morally acceptable. It's something that they feel empowered to get away with because they're more anonymous. They're in a group. They're harder to distinguish individuality, and maybe they're wearing the same thing, or everybody looks very similar, and it would be difficult to pick out an individual from that crowd. So that's de-individuation, and again, that's being empowered by the lack of distinguishment inside of a crowd or a group dynamic. Group polarization is something you see play out politically, or even on college campuses, and that's when people kind of group up with similar ideologies, and as they get to know each other and they kind of reaffirm their own beliefs and each other's beliefs, it tends to create a polarizing effect. So in other words, you might see this happen with conservatives and liberals on a college campus, where people who are more conservatively minded politically will join in a campus organization with other conservatives, and they reaffirm each other's beliefs, which causes less of a middle ground between the two groups, and actually causes them to separate even further, right? It's kind of the echo chamber effect, and that's the group polarization ideology, that when people get together and discuss things, they actually reaffirm and strengthen those thoughts. So typically it's politics when you see that used in an FRQ or on the exam, but it doesn't have to be politics. So think echo chambers on social media would be another example of group polarization. And then of course groupthink. Groupthink is what happens inside of a group dynamic when people will go along with the narrative of the group, even if they don't necessarily think it's okay, or they believe it because the desire for harmony outweighs the truth. And so if someone has an objection to something that the group is espousing, and maybe they're even getting it carried away with, they may be less likely to bring it up as an objection because they don't want to go against what the group believes. Here's Solomon Asch, just a screenshot of the line segment sample. Right, again, it was a social field experiment where there were Confederates, which means people that were on the study, who were all given specific instructions to mention line segments that clearly were not the same length as Exhibit 1, and the goal of the study was to see how many people would conform. And he found that I think it was something like 25% of the people in the study conformed most of the time, meaning that they picked the obviously wrong letter choice for the line segment because they felt pressured to do so, either because of informational, social influence, or because of a desire to fit in, which would be a normative social influence. And so 25% of them conformed to the group even when they knew it was wrong most of the time. And then I think another 50% of the people that Asch tested conformed at least once in the trial. So only 25% of the people in the study, so 75% of the people in the study conformed at least once as they were influenced by the answers of the group, and only 25% of the people in the study did not conform at all and just gave the honest answers that they believed to be the truth. So again, some of them claimed afterwards that it was because they felt pressured to say the same thing as the group, which would be an example of normative. social influence. It was a desire to fit in. But even some of the participants in Asch's study said that they picked the same answer as the group, or they conformed, in other words, because they felt like maybe they were the ones who were wrong. And that's an example of informational social influence. If 4 people, or I think there were 6 or 7 Confederates, if 6 people all pick line segment B, and you know it's not line segment B, but you begin to doubt whether or not it is something that you're not considering, and so you side with the group just because you think that they may be correct and you may be the one that's incorrect, which would be an example of informational social influence. So that's Solomon Asch. Of course, Stanley Milgram we mentioned with the electric shock experiment, and his theory was about the power of an authority figure and what are the limits that people will go to out of obedience. Milgram was motivated and inspired by the legal defense at the Nuremberg the Nuremberg trials after the Holocaust in the 1940s and the 1950s. Milgram was a Jewish kid from the Bronx who was fascinated by the idea that people who committed atrocities against entire ethnic groups during the Holocaust as part of the Nazi Party could claim on the stand that they were simply following orders. And so that didn't seem like a viable thing. Milgram believed, like most psychologists did at the time, that that's sadistic behavior and that people would not go as far as harming a stranger or killing another human being or tens of thousands of human beings simply because they were told to. And so he devised a study just to test the limits of people's willingness to obey. And in his study, he created the illusion that the participants were administering electric shocks to someone on the other side of a wall who they could hear through a speaker. And so they were tasked with asking them simple questions with multiple choice answers. If the person got the answer wrong, then they were supposed to be administering an increasingly higher level of shock. And I think the board that was used in Milgram's studies, he did something like 15 or 16 trials. The board that was used, I think it went up in increments of 15 volts at a time, all the way up to 450 volts, which is a lethal amount of electricity. And so he wanted to see how many of the participants would be willing to administer a lethal level of electric shock on a stranger simply because somebody in a lab coat asked them to. And of course, there was a lot of diffusion of responsibility. There was some emotional stress and turmoil. A lot of people were very convicted about harming someone. They didn't find it to be morally right, and they showed legitimate concern, which is empathy, which is the opposite of sociopathic behavior. But yet still in every one of his trials, the results were almost identical, even in the trial that had all women. And it was about 66% of the participants were willing to go the full measure of electric shock treatments, even up to 450 volts, just out of an act of obedience, which defied the criticism when Milgram was pitching the idea. He interviewed psychiatrists and psychologists and asked them how many or what percentage of the participants would be willing to actually shock a stranger to a lethal level, and the prediction was about 1% of them, because if it's a microcosm of society, meaning it's a representative sample, that is sadistic behavior, which is really antisocial. So only about 1% of the population would suffer from such a severe lack of empathy that they actually could shock someone to a lethal level. But that was not what his results showed, obviously. Then we get into cultural influence, things like norms. Norms are unwritten rules or expectations inside of societies, and so there are various social norms. You even have categories of social norms for guys versus females in our Western industrial society, especially in our American society, right? Things like man laws, and these are just unwritten rules of things that people understood and understand that are done or just not done. Those are kind of expectations that aren't necessarily clearly explained, but people kind of implicitly pick up on them and they become expectations. Personal space is obviously one of those cultural examples of things that is not the same in every culture or in every let's say anthropological subcategory of people. That's not a biological difference, it's definitely very much a cultural difference. When you look at things like prejudice, discrimination, and the differences between them, you have to kind of differentiate the difference between prejudice and discrimination, stereotypes, and scapegoat theory. Prejudice is a bias that we have in our mind. It's a thought, it's an attitude is the best way to put it, whereas discrimination is an act, it's a behavior. So having a thought or a preconceived notion about a group of people would be an example of a prejudice, but committing an act of discrimination would be a behavior, right? So for example, thinking that people of color are racially inferior during the civil rights movement in the American South is an example of prejudice, but segregation is an example of discrimination, right? So it's an actual act as opposed to just an attitude. And prejudices are based on our biases, which are inherently built into us as we kind of differentiate what is safe, what is known, what are we used to, what poses a threat to us. And so when our prejudices turn into stereotypes, then those can perpetuate hate, they can perpetuate racism, sexism, right, homophobia and things like that, ageism. So stereotypes can be positive or they can be negative in the sense that there are stereotypes that are traits that would be considered good, right? Stereotypes that, say for instance, that Southeastern Asian cultures, people would be better at STEM subjects like math, physics, chemistry, the empirical sciences would be an example of a stereotype. So there's negative stereotypes and positive stereotypes. They are a type of prejudice. And then of course you get in-group and out-group bias. The in-group is any identification category, which is sort of the problem with identity politics that we're seeing kind of a lot in our society. People identify in various categories, which creates an in-group. That kind of leads to certain things like in-group preferences, or our abilities to, or our tendency to default to our own group, our preference for our own group, which leads to bias against people who are outside of that group. So whether it's a racial subtype, or whether it's our gender, whether it's our ethnicity, whether it's a fraternity or a sorority, or the fandom of a sports team, whatever the group is that we identify as can lead to bias against people who are outside of that group. Scapegoat theory is obviously an example of prejudice, which we've seen multiple times throughout history, where a group of people is prejudicially blamed for a societal problem, or a problem that's obviously way more complex than just being perpetuated by an entire group. So when you see neo-Nazi groups or white supremacist groups blaming people of Jewish heritage or people of color, Catholics and things like that, that's an example of scapegoat theory. Of course, the anti-Semitism that existed throughout Europe in ancient time periods, and certainly during the Holocaust, is an example of scapegoat theory. It is kind of a straw man argument that gives a face or a name to explain or to blame societal problems on. The other race effect is a common phenomenon that happens for people inside of racial types, genotypes, where they can recognize the differences among people that share their race, but they tend to not be able to tell the difference between people of other races. So they would have a difficult time recognizing the different facial features or telling people apart from a different race, but can notice the the facial differences of people inside of their own race. The just world phenomenon is an example of sort of this cognitive distortion, a mentality. It really kind of doesn't belong on this slide, but the just world phenomenon is the idea that people mistakenly it's almost like the heavens reward fallacy, which is another cognitive distortion that's very similar, that people tend to just assume that there's some kind of cosmic karma, and that, or some universal, judicial process where people that experience bad things deserve what happens to them, and that people who have positive outcomes or good things that come their way, that they deserve those. So people deserve what they get, and people get what they deserve, which is obviously a fallacy. There's lots of unfair things and uncontrollable tragedies and trauma that happen to people through no fault of their own. And on the flip side of that coin, there's obviously people who benefit from privilege that they did not earn or deserve, which is kind of why the just world phenomenon is it's a justification for people to explain and navigate trauma that they don't understand or things that are outside of their control. It's an external locus of control, I should say. And again, some more some social psych terms, things like the frustration aggression principle. Aggression is a tendency toward violent acts, although they don't have to be violent to be aggressive. The frustration aggression principle is a sociological idea that people who are under a lot of stress, and especially people in underserviced communities, or people who have very difficult socioeconomics, or they might be navigating just a hard life, just difficult problems, tend to be more aggressive. It's just kind of like a natural byproduct and response to sympathetic nervous arousal, physiological stress, which leads to testosterone increases and cortisol, adrenaline, and things like that. Attraction, a couple things to know about inside of attraction. We're talking about romantic attraction between people. You have this concept of the mere exposure effect, which is essentially that when people warm up to and bond with, or at least get to the point of comfortability where they let their guard down and accept someone because they are around them quite often. And so there's a huge part of the attraction component that has to do with people just warming up to others that they're used to, people that they're around all the time. So that's the mere exposure effect, of the fact that by merely being around people on a regular basis, they tend to become less guarded, and they become more affectionate towards people that they get used to. And then, of course, there is the distinguishment between passionate and companionate love. Passion, obviously, would be the testosterone and dopamine fueled, or maybe even vasopressin in the case of the male, physiological response. So it could be sexual arousal, or even just not sexual passion itself, but the honeymoon passion that happens early on in relationships when people have a physiological response. It is very much chemical, and it is not a rational, logical intimacy that's based on companionship like companionate love is. Companionate love is more of a calm, deep connection that's not the physiological or emotional passion. Companionate love is kind of the natural progression or the byproduct of a healthy, passionate relationship. The passion begins to fade and gets replaced by intimacy and companionship, and that typically is what the progression of a romantic relationship tends to be. You look at the physiology, and there have been plenty of studies done about the physiology of humans inside of passionate relationships, and certainly in sexual relationships. For women, the hormone that tends to help them kind of bond with people and fall in love more often is a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. And oxytocin is kind of the bonding chemical. It's typically what gets released in the brain when we have a shared life experience. When you pet a dog, when you meet a new person and have a positive experience. That's the chemical that tends to drive most of the connection and companionship, especially in the female brain. In the male brain, connection is a little bit different. And in studies, you can see oxytocin releases in women in situations where they feel safe. And it's different in men. In the male brain, you tend to see less oxytocin and more of another neurotransmitter called vasopressin. And vasopressin is kind of more associated with stress and aggression. And so for men, that bonding happens actually in a state of stress. I don't want to say trauma, but when you put men in a danger type situation, and they're able to overcome that or combat that, that tends to be an experience that bonds men either together with each other as friends or with a woman romantically. And so men tend to connect with people, connect with women romantically, and bond with them over stress situations. Ironically, whereas females are kind of the opposite. It is the connections, the most emotional connections, the physical touch, and even sexual climax at orgasm that has the highest levels of oxytocin for bonding in the brain. And that's second for females. That level of oxytocin during sex is second only to childbirth. That's the highest spike of oxytocin in the female brain is during the birthing process. So it's fascinating physiological differences between the early parts of a relationship during the passion phase and then the progression into the companionate love phase that becomes deeply connected. It is less superficial, but it is also less emotionally charged. You get into some of the last module of the unit in chapter 14 is about sort of the group dynamics of how people see the world and view the world and try to fix the world's problems or take responsibility for things that they see around them. And that can be either increased or decreased based on the situation. So for instance, the bystander effect is an example of when people are less likely actually to get involved in a high stress or trauma situation. They're less likely to intervene in a situation if there's a larger group of people present. So if someone has like a medical emergency, appears to have a heart attack on say like a city bus, it's actually less likely that people will get up and go to help them, simply because there are more people around, and the assumption is that someone else will be more qualified or more willing to lend assistance. Whereas by that same regard, those same people would spring into action if they witnessed a medical emergency and there was no one around. So the bystander effect is kind of this phenomenon that suggests that people are actually much more hesitant to help when there are more people present than they would be if they were the only other person present. So you won't leave people on the side of the road if you don't think that there's someone else who can help them. But if you're in a crowded space, like a public space, it's way more likely that you would continue to walk on and not offer assistance, simply because, not out of a lack of empathy, but simply because you assume that there are other people around who can lend a hand and will lend a hand. Social exchange and reciprocity norms, social responsibility norms, again, is kind of like part of these social scripts of things that people just believe are part of their role in society, sort of a civic connection, if you want to say that. Like social responsibility norm is this idea, it's a fairly progressive or liberal idea. I mean that in the literal sense, not the political sense, but that the idea that people should be eager and willing to help as part of their duty, their responsibility, those that are less fortunate in situations that they can lend a hand. So people should be willing to, and you do see this after natural disasters, people help, they help hurricane cleanup or tornado cleanup, or they lend a hand in putting tarps on roofs, and they hand out water and help people who are down on their luck for various reasons. And so you do kind of see the social responsibility norm play out. And reciprocity norm is this assumption that people make, and a lot of times it's a faulty assumption, that what they're willing to provide as a service will be reciprocated to them. So if you would be willing to help somebody change a flat tire on the side of the road, and that's your social responsibility, then you would genuinely expect that if you had a flat tire and you were in that same situation, that somebody else would reciprocate that, and that they would stop and they would help you. The social trap. The social trap is an interesting dynamic. It's not quite conformity. It could be because of conformity, but it's typically something that happens when there is a group behavior that people participate in, which is beneficial at first. They trade long-term negative effects for immediate gratification. So it would be examples of things that at first are good and have a positive outcome, a desirable outcome, but ultimately later are difficult to get out of, or difficult to end, in fact are often usually harmful. So an example would be like social drinking, binge drinking at parties is a social trap. At first there is the benefit of the intoxication, the connection with friends, fitting in with the group, and a shared experience, and just the chemical altering of the mind with the intoxication. But the trap there is hangovers, destructive behaviors long term, people who become addicts, alcoholics, the negative side effects to the body and to the brain from alcohol abuse. And so those are much later harmful effects of something that at first seems good. Promiscuous sexual behaviors are another example of a social trap. It may be something that as a teenager people participate in certain risky behaviors because they are desirable or pleasurable, but as they progress on, there are negative consequences on the back end. So that's social trap. Superordinate goals is another vocab term. It's this idea that when you have multiple groups that typically maybe don't even collaborate, but they will put their differences aside and they collaborate for a goal that's bigger than themselves. So you think about like the political cooperation between Republicans and Democrats around the country after 9/11. You think about what happens in cities like ours when there's a hurricane. That's when you have multiple groups that are working together in a joint effort to fix a problem that's a superior problem. It's a bigger problem than typically what they would spend their efforts on. So that would be an example of a superordinate goal. It's a goal that kind of is bigger and requires cooperation and collaboration by multiple groups of people in order to get it done. So an example would be like fighting poverty, social injustice, racial equality, genuine social change that requires collaboration from lots of different groups of people. Attempts to end global hunger, food packing events, missions to international countries. Those are all examples of superordinate goals. They require cooperation from different groups, all working together in conjunction to fix a larger problem than what they typically would be solving on their own as individual groups. And then you have Angela Duckworth and her idea of grit. Grit is her definition. It's an acronym, but it is her explanation for the single greatest predictive factor of success in an academic setting or then later in job settings and things like that. It is the passion and perseverance to overcome adversity. In other words, the lack of giving up and the ability to rebound from failure. Determination is a good synonym for grit. So it's maybe conscientiousness, if you want to use the big 5 personality trait example. And so it is very much a trait that people would possess in order to achieve at a high level, right? So that they experience some failure or what have you, but they are able to overcome that because they have the trait of grit. So that should be it. That is it for chapter 14's review. Hope it helps.